Here we have our character head. This is the one that we're going to be detailing on. And I'm going to begin by making sure I'm at the highest possible subdivision level. And I'm going to store a morph target. And you may remember from previous classes where we talked about using morph targets to blend off shapes. I'm going to use the morph target here as an eraser. Once I lay in texture, I'm going to try and blend out the edges by using the morph brush. So make sure we're at the highest possible subdivision level. We'll go to morph target, store morph target. Now if I were to go in, drag rectangle brush, let's go to our alphas, leathery skin, and let's say that we've used this particular alpha here. We've added some texture. Now if we go to the morph brush, turn down our Z intensity, we can blend off the edges, or we can erase it completely. So it's really valuable to use a morph target with the morph brush while you're doing skin details. So the first step is divide your head up as high as you can go and store a morph target. Now the next step is optional. You can break your textures across into multiple layers under the layers menu here, but I will say that sometimes this can really increase your file size, and on some people's systems I've seen it cause instability. So give it a try, save lots of iterations, and see how it works out for you. I'm going to go ahead and create a layer here at the top subdivision level. Rename this layer Base Skin Texture. And in this layer, I'm going to put in just the initial texture map, if you will. I'm going to put in a rough pass of pores and wrinkles in the areas where I think they're going to be, in the general size and shape that they're going to be. And then I'm going to use that as a basis to go in and start finessing the skin texture. I like to cover the whole thing with a layer of texture first, and then I can go and smooth back and erase and dial things back in as I see that it needs it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this tool. There we go. So with your model prepped, with the layers in place, we're ready to go ahead and start. So I'll begin just by making a few little tweaks here with the move brush. So I'm going to adjust some of these forms here. And again, when I detail, I will also go in and do a few more form tweaks. Oops. I want to turn off the alpha on my clay brush, my clay tubes brush. Dial down the focal shift. Smooth that back a bit. There we go. So the first thing that I'd like to do is just sketch in where the major wrinkles are going to be. I'll do that by selecting the standard brush, a freehand stroke, and alpha 1. Now when you're doing this and you turn down your draw size and you drag a stroke, let me turn up the draw size so you can see this better. Sometimes your stroke will become staggered. Let me turn up my Z intensity so it can, there you go. So you'll get this dotting in the stroke sometimes if you make a fast stroke. I'm going to undo both of those. What you can do is go to the brush menu, tear that off, and down here under modifiers, there's one called trails. If I turn trails up to 2, this acts sort of like lazy mouse. But what it does is it allows you more interactive control. You don't have the delay with that red line on your brush that you get with lazy mouse. So here, if I draw this, you can see that it actually smooths that stroke out. So it helps you avoid getting the dotting in there. So you only need to turn that on in the occasion where you're pulling a really fine line and you're getting that dotting in there. So let's go into the corners of the eye here and see if we can't get some nice shapes happening. So I'm going to dial down the draw size, and I'm just going to start sketching in. Here you can see I'm getting that dotting, so I'm going to turn up trails. I'm going to turn off my alpha. There we go. And I'm just going to start sketching in the directionality of the wrinkles in the corners of the eye. I want them to feather out. And I try and make my wrinkles as sort of sketchy lines here. I don't want them to be just straight cuts. I stop and start and try and cross-hatch them as I go. And go to the move brush, pull this down a little bit. I've raised the lower lids so they're coming up over the iris as well, so the grin translates up into the eyes. I want there to be compression here in the eyes as well. If you have a grin that doesn't translate into the eyes, it actually psychologically reads as very false. There was an interesting documentary from the BBC about the human face and expression, and they talked about that if the grin does not reach the eyes, it has the impression of someone just smiling for a photograph. A genuine grin affects the entire face. Now, something to keep in mind in this initial wrinkle map is you're going to lose a lot of these wrinkles. We're going to smooth these back. These are going to go away for the most part. We're going to keep aspects of them. Some of these strokes will stay. But don't worry about being a little bit overstated at this point. Just remember that we are going to need to dial these back. We're going to have some wrinkles crossing over here. Remember, we've got our wrinkles that come up from the mouth. These are going to radiate out from the mouth. Don't have to completely detail any of these areas yet. We're just trying to sketch in the directionality of them. Just what I call a wrinkle map. Just where all these wrinkles are going to go. Dial up my draw size a bit. Go to alpha 1. That's a little too heavy. I'm going to turn my trails down to 2. And I will turn on lazy mouse at this point. You can see how lazy mouse makes it harder to make a really exacting stroke, but it gives you a very smooth stroke. But that's okay for this stage because these wrinkles, like I said, are just a map. We will end up losing these. And if you're finding that your system isn't being very interactive, if it's slow because you're at the highest subdivision level, you can always hide part of the model and just look at the part that you're working on right now. Here around the neck, just going to sketch in some wrinkles here in the neck area. And these are slashing lines, which, again, this is not the final form of the wrinkle. It's just sort of a visual note. Almost like a note to self. We're going to have wrinkles flowing in this direction here. We're going to have wrinkles flowing in this direction and cross-hatching these wrinkles here. I'm going to have wrinkles here at the pit of the neck that radiate out and over the chest muscles. I'm going to switch to the basic material 2 because that specular shine again really helps me see exactly what's happening. Turning off X symmetry. Turn off lazy mouse. Turn up trails. Just sketching these in. Smooth that back a bit. And I just step down a subdivision level because for this particular step I actually don't need to be at the highest subdivision level. I can get these wrinkles in one step lower, which allows me a more interactive workflow. I can rotate around and drag strokes quicker. I want to run some wrinkles up beside the ear here. Now I'm going to change to a different alpha here. I'm going to go to alpha 58 right here, which is a long wrinkle alpha. I'm going to turn down my Z intensity, turn up my draw size, and I'm just going to sketch these again in the direction of the wrinkle flow. This is a really nice alpha. It's one of my favorites that comes with ZBrush. Bring those wrinkles down and around the pit of the neck here. Feather them out over the shoulders. Run those wrinkles across the back of the neck. There we go. We can move our light around and see how that skin texture is working on the surface. Bring those wrinkles around the cheeks from the corner of the eye. Remember, you can treat wrinkles like a design element. You can guide the eye around the design using the wrinkles just like you do the folds of flesh or the major lines of the design itself. Bring these out, radiate these out from the mouth. And turn my trails down. And here we go. So that feels like a good generalized map. So I'm going to go down to my layers menu, step up a subdivision level so I can access the base skin texture layer here again. With this selected, I'm actually going to rename it. Make sure that it's selected because you're going to have this darker line on the layer if it's actually active and selected. If it's all gray, it's not selected. It's not really clear. It could have been better interface design there, but it's something to keep an eye on. I'm going to name this wrinkle map. And I'm going to change the intensity to 0.5. And you see how that really dials that back. I made a few form changes in there too. You see in the face, if I were to turn this on and off, you can see that I actually made some changes to the grid. So there we go. So that dials back the opacity of that wrinkle map. So it allows me to see it, but I can still now work into it, work over it. I'm going to create a new layer now. Rename this layer Base Pores. Now we're just going to put a layer of pore texture over the head. So I'm going to go to the standard brush. I'm going to go to the dot stroke this time. And for my alpha, I'm going to select lots of pores. This alpha here. And that's one of the Rick Baker alphas that you can download from Pixelogic's website. Now this time I'm going to go to the stroke menu. Now if I were to drag my stroke now, this is what I get. I want to spatter these out. I want to spray these pores out. So I'm going to go to the stroke menu. I'm going to turn on lazy mouse, but I'm going to turn lazy smooth all the way down and lazy radius all the way down. I'm going to turn lazy step up. So what I end up with is this spattering effect. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key so I end up with Z sub. And I'm going to stay away from the face right now because I want more generalized, or I want more specific pore sizes and shapes in the face. But around the neck and the back of the head, I can give it a nice overall skin texture. And I'm just doing that by stroking along, holding down Z sub, and adding the texture, the tooth, the pores here. You can see by using lazy mouse with those settings, it really does allow me to just texture stamp it on really quickly. It allows me to be chaotic with it and fast. You can see down here where the sphere is stretching, the texture gets a little bit stretched. It's just a side effect of doing this on top of a sphere. If you were to use the remeshing tools that we talk about later on to actually remesh this head, you could rectify that area and concentrate more geometry there. And I'll show you in a little bit how you can locally subdivide to fix areas that become just entirely too stretched, where you can't get any good texture on them. So we're brushing this pore texture all the way around. I'm going to dial up my draw size a little bit, dial down my Z intensity. And if you're going to be doing something that you're eventually going to render under a subsurface scattering shader, sometimes it's good to overstate your texture. Anytime you're going to be doing something that's going to be on a translucent material, the skin texture will get heavily muted. It's just like in practical effects, if you're sculpting something that's going to be cast in silicone, which is a translucent material, a lot of artists will overstate the texture pass on their sculpture, really, heavily texturing the clay with the expectation that a lot of that texture will be lost in the silicone. So I'm going to put a fine texture layer on the ears here. And let's bring these pores up into the temple. And I'm doing this asymmetrically. I really think that the more you can use asymmetry, the better off you're going to be. Especially when you're doing things like skin details, because that's something that you're definitely going to pick out as being symmetrical and wrong, are wrinkles and pores. Especially once you get to the center line of the head, it starts to make patterns that look like a Rorschach ink blot. And you're definitely going to psychologically pick up that something is wrong. Turning off perspective. Just texturing here. Alright, so now we're going to start putting some skin texture into the face itself. I'm going to move my light over here. I'm going to turn on my secondary light. Place it here. And I'm going to change from the dot stroke to the drag rectangle stroke. So I want there to be long pores. So I'm going to go to my light box, alphas, and here's long pores, alpha. I'm going to select the long pores because the pores that run along the nasolabial fold here tend to get stretched because your skin is stretching there. So the texture of the skin will also become stretched. Those pores will actually take on a more oval appearance. So I'm going to use the drag rectangle stroke so I can just drag out, turn off lazy mouse, so I can just drag out a single instance of the pores here. I'm going to turn up my Z intensity a bit. Here we go. The pores that you get, that's too big, the pores you get at the tip of the nose have a tendency to be rounder and finer, depending on how old the person is and the quality of the nose, but the pores on the cheeks have a tendency to be finer and tighter. And you also want to make sure that you vary your texture scale. You don't want everything to be the same scale and look like it's stamped over the whole head. That's why I'm trying to vary the size of these pores as I drag these strokes down. Now I'm going to switch to the lots of pores. I'm going to drag some pores here onto the tip of the nose. Let's turn up our Z intensity. Oops, not that much. I'm going to create finer pores here on the tip of the nose. You got to be careful when you're dragging a drag rectangle stroke around a curve. Sometimes you lose control and it becomes way too big, like that. So you want to be careful of that. And these pores are a little bit overstated, but remember we can dial these back using the morph brush. So sometimes it's almost better to have it too heavy rather than not heavy enough, because you can very easily push those shapes back. Here, I'll show you exactly what I mean. If I go to the morph brush now, My Z intensity is set to a low setting. If I just gently stroke along the surface, you can see that those pores start to get knocked back. And because I made some changes to the face, I'm going to need to turn off my base pores layer. I want these form changes to stay on the face, but I don't want the pore texture to stay on. So what I'll do is I'll delete my morph target and store it again now. Go back to my base pores layer. Now my morph brush will just blend out the pores. It won't actually change the shape of the face that I altered earlier. Going back to the standard brush, I'm on drag rectangle. I'm going to drag some pores here into the eyebrow area. I'm scaling them down as they come down around the corner of the brow. Going back to the brush menu and the morph brush. And I'm just going to feather the edges. Try and knock back that initial layer. When you're doing textures too, you may want to make sure that you AA half your document, because if you look at the difference between actual size, you can see how noisy the pores look, and then AA half, the skin texture takes on a more natural, smoothed out look. So just be aware of that. That's one aspect of the ZBrush menu that can actually, or the ZBrush document window, that can actually mislead you. Make sure that your texture scale does match on both sides. You got to be careful with that if you're not using symmetry. Now I'll show you right here at the center of the head. If I had X symmetry turned on, you can see how the pores become very obviously symmetrical. So that's one of the main reasons why I turn off symmetry when I'm texturing or detailing. I mean, you can turn off symmetry just when you get to the center line of the head, but I kind of think it's worthwhile not having it on at all. Go back to the morph brush. Let's blend these back. I'm going to add some of these pores around the cheeks here. I'm going to make the pores in the cheeks a little bit bigger. In the areas where you see the texture stretching a bit, it's just because we sculpted this from a sphere. That's where the limitation of sphere sculpting does come across. You need to make sure that you can get your mesh subdivided as high as possible. And the only way to do that is just make sure you have plenty of RAM. Here it's stretching right here because that's where the geometry is stretching. But when it's all told, I don't feel like that's going to be a big problem. Especially if you were to be rendering this with a color map and everything else, you could easily go in and sharpen areas. And again, you could also rectify that stuff just by remeshing the head. If you are getting to a point where you're going to be rendering this in another program, like Maya, for instance, Mental Ray, then by that stage you'll have the information that you need from this class on how to remesh this head into an animation-ready topology. Bring some lighter pores up into the eye area. And once you've got the information on how to remesh, then these resolution issues won't be a problem anymore. But they're minor on this guy. I just wanted to call them out since you may be noticing them. I just wanted to let you know that there is a workaround for it. There is a process for that, but we're just not to that stage of the class yet. Again, bringing some light pores up into the eye socket or the eyelids. Again, notice that I am varying my texture scale. In the years I've been teaching this class, the number one thing I see people do when they turn in their homework for this particular assignment is they don't vary their texture scale. Be thinking about the size of the pores in each area. Get on Google Images and look up some reference. And look at how the pores are scaled in different parts of the face. You have to find some pretty high-res images, but they're definitely out there. You may even be able to find some images just of pores from different parts of the face. Let's do some texturing here on the upper lip. This is an area that's stretching just a bit. Make sure we get some texture up into the nostrils. You know, there is a noise control that you can use in ZBrush to add an overall surface noise to the entire face, which can be useful. I don't necessarily like it because I don't think it works well as skin, but I think it works nicely as rock, stone, or just natural material. Or if you're just trying to make something look like a clay sketch for presentation purposes. And that's under this, we've used it before, it's under the surface slider here, noise. You just apply it to the mesh. I'm not going to do it on this guy, but I did want to just mention that again. We used that in class 3. When we added noise to the horns. So here I'm scaling up the pores as they come down towards the chin. Make sure you rotate your stroke just to adjust the positioning of each of these pores. Go. Make sure we get the top here. The cheekbone looks like we may be missing some texture here. Take in a larger texture here on this front crest. Oops, not that large. That's a situation where if you drag your stroke around a corner, it can snap because it's going and snapping to the back there. So you just need to make sure that you don't do that. There we are. What happens is as you're drawing your stroke, ZBrush is suddenly over that back part of the model and it thinks that you've stretched it much further. So in that situation, sometimes you just need to turn the model. Or just drag in the other direction. In just a moment, I'm going to switch back to my standard brush, and I'm going to spray some texture up here at the top. Just want to make sure that I get all these areas covered nicely that are down closer to the face. Go back to the standard brush, the dot stroke, and lots of pores will be fine. Turn on lazy mouse again, and we'll just start stamping it in. And rotate around to the top, and then rotate forward a bit so I make sure that I hit any areas that might have been obscured because of undercuts. Just want to get a little bit of texture on everything. And this area here on the underside of this crest. In this situation, I will turn on X symmetry because you'll never be able to see these two sides at the same time. I'm just going to spray some texture up into there and along this horn as well. I'm just adding a quick few strokes along the horn. Just add a little bit of noise there.